I still remember the first time my dad told me about his old friend, Marcus, and the strange camping trip he went on back in 2014. He never liked talking about it around other people, but one day he opened up to me when we were sitting alone in the garage. I don't know why he chose that moment, but I could tell the story had been stuck in his head for years. When he finished, it stayed with me too. It felt too real, too raw, and too possible. Even now, when I think about forests or camping or the idea of being alone in the dark, I can picture everything he described so clearly that it feels like I was there. Marcus was 32 that year, working long night shifts at a packaging plant outside a small town in Oregon. He was burnt out, always tired, always dealing with stress, and he needed to get away from everything for a few days. He wasn't the kind of person to go to beaches or crowded tourist spots. He preferred quiet places where he could disappear for a weekend and reset his mind. He chose a forested area near the foothills of some mountains, a place he had visited twice before. It wasn't an official campground, but it wasn't illegal to camp there either. It was one of those forgotten pieces of land that only a few locals knew about. He packed light, just a small tent, a sleeping bag, a few cans of food, a tiny camping stove, and a roadside map since he never fully trusted GPS signals in the woods. It was late September, the air cold enough at night to sting the skin but warm enough during the day to hike without freezing. He drove 2 hours up empty roads, losing all signs of civilization as he got deeper into the forest. The kind of place where one wrong turn could leave you lost for hours. But he liked that. He liked the feeling of being cut off, even if it felt a little uncomfortable. By the time he parked near the old logging trail, the light was already fading. He walked almost half an hour into the trees before he found a spot that felt isolated enough. The ground there was uneven, covered in pine needles and damp soil, but he didn't mind. He set up his tent, built a small fire, and cooked a simple meal. For the first night, everything was calm. He said the silence was so thick it felt like a blanket, and the firelight gave him something to focus on while the darkness pressed in from every direction. The second day was peaceful too. He spent hours wandering the area, following animal tracks, checking streams for fish, and taking in the cold, sharp air. The sun dipped fast behind the trees that evening, swallowing the light faster than he expected. He made his second little fire, ate quietly, and crawled into his tent early. This is where things changed. Late into the night, he woke up for no clear reason. His eyes opened, and his body felt stiff from the cold. He lay there in the dark, listening. The forest rarely slept. There was always some kind of sound, but at that moment it felt strangely still. He said it was the silence that scared him first. It wasn't normal. Every insect, every breeze, every rustle seemed to have stopped at the exact same time. He felt something shift in his stomach, that quiet, heavy drop that comes before you realize something isn't right. He pushed himself upright and listened harder. Nothing, not even the faint ringing in the distance that usually came from wind moving through branches. It was like someone had hit a mute switch on the entire world. He tried to calm himself by taking slow breaths, but the silence was so thick it felt like it was pressing against the tent walls. He told himself it was probably just the cold slowing down the usual forest noise. But as he adjusted himself inside the sleeping bag, he felt a soft vibration in the ground. Barely noticeable, almost like the tremble of someone dragging something heavy far away. He wasn't sure what it was at first, so he kept still. Another faint tremor came, slow and uneven. He stayed frozen, leaning slightly forward in the darkness, his heartbeat loud enough to echo inside his ears. The vibration came again, this time closer. It wasn't strong, but it wasn't the kind of movement you could explain away easily. It was the type of disturbance caused by footsteps, not the light kind from animals, but something heavier, something moving with weight. He felt a sharp chill run down his back as he realized the vibrations were in a pattern. Step, pause, step, pause. Slowly, steadily, coming closer from the direction of the trail he had walked earlier that day. He sat there, gripping the edge of his sleeping bag so tightly his knuckles ached. He didn't move, didn't make a single sound. The footsteps got clearer as they entered the area around his camp. He couldn't see anything from where he sat, but he could imagine someone or something standing just outside the tent. Not rushing, not stumbling, just standing there. He said the fear was a strange kind. It wasn't a burst of panic, but a deep, sinking dread that felt like concrete settling in his chest. His tent was thin, too thin. If someone wanted to reach inside, it would take less than a second. Minutes passed. Long, slow minutes where he heard nothing except the faint sound of breathing. Not his own. A steady exhale from somewhere outside. Light but unmistakable. He stayed completely still, holding his breath until his lungs burned. The breathing outside faded, replaced by slow steps circling the tent. The ground trembled just slightly each time. He could tell whoever or whatever it was, they were moving with intention. Not wandering, not lost, checking the area, checking him. He didn't know how long he stayed frozen like that, but eventually the footsteps moved away. Not quickly, not in a panic, but with the same slow rhythm until they faded back into silence. Marcus didn't sleep again that night. He stayed sitting up with his flashlight in his hand, too afraid to unzip the tent and look outside. When dawn came, he finally stepped out. The ground was marked. Someone had walked around his camp area. The footsteps were human, large, deep, and spaced in a way that suggested a tall person. But the part that disturbed him most was the direction they came from. They came from deeper in the forest, not from the trail, not from any road, not from any direction that made sense. He packed everything quickly, barely eating, barely breathing. The forest felt wrong now. Every shadow seemed to watch him. Every branch looked like a hand reaching out. On his way back, he found something he hadn't noticed while arriving. An old, rusted metal sign half buried in the brush. Most of the paint was gone, but he could make out one faded word: restricted. He realized then that he had camped near an area that wasn't meant to be accessed. Whether it was private land, unused government property, or something left behind from old operations, he never figured out. But he knew one thing: someone was still using it. Someone who didn't expect a stranger to show up in the middle of the night. Someone who had walked around his tent while he slept, checking his presence in complete silence. He made it back to his car without looking back. But even as he drove away, he felt watched. Like someone was standing behind the tree line, following him with their eyes until the forest swallowed the road. He never returned to that area again. He never camped alone again either. Every time he tried, he would remember the footsteps, the breathing, the silence, and the fact that whoever came to his tent wasn't an animal or a lost hiker. It was someone who lived in that forgotten space, someone who moved through the woods without a sound, someone who didn't want him there. The part that stays with him the most, what he told my dad years later, is that the footsteps stopped right behind his tent for almost 2 full minutes. Long enough for a person to watch him through the thin fabric. Long enough to decide something. Long enough to let him live or not. He never knew why they left him alone that night, but he never forgot how close he came to finding out what kind of person roamed that quiet, restricted piece of forest. And he never forgot that the silence he heard wasn't natural. It was the silence of someone else listening for him. That was the ending of his story, and it was clear enough. He survived because whoever was out there chose to walk away. And that was the only reason he ever got to tell anyone what happened. I had been wanting a quiet break for months, so in late September of 2019 I finally took a week off and drove into a remote part of Western Austria. Near the edge of a valley, people didn't talk about much. Most tourists stayed close to the towns, the lakes, the easy trails. I wanted a place where I could walk for hours without meeting anyone. Somewhere far from phone signals, paved roads, or the noise of people. I packed light gear, simple food, a small tent, and enough water to last 2 days, planning to refill from streams once I got deeper into the area. The air felt colder than I expected when I stepped out of the car, and the wind carried that early autumn smell of wet leaves and cooling soil. I tightened my jacket, checked my backpack straps one more time, and started walking along a narrow dirt path that wound uphill between tall pines. The trees seemed older here, thicker and darker than the ones near the highways, and after only 10 minutes the road disappeared behind me like it had never existed. I spent the first hour enjoying the quiet. Every step made a soft crunch on the needles covering the ground. Occasionally I would hear a bird or the distant snap of a branch deeper in the forest. Nothing unusual. I kept a steady pace until the terrain began to rise sharply. By noon I was sweating under my clothes, but the cold air dried it quickly. The valley opened slightly at one point, and I could see a line of low mountains across the distance, their tops hidden by a thin layer of cloud. That quiet view made me feel like I was alone in the world, in a good way. By late afternoon, I reached the place I had chosen on the map a week earlier. It was a flat patch of ground near a stream that flowed slow and clear. There were rocks along one side that looked like they had been pushed up long ago by some old landslide. I set my pack down and took a slow breath, enjoying how clean the air smelled. Setting up the tent took only a few minutes. I put it close to the stream but far enough that the ground felt firm. My boots were covered in dust, so I sat on a rock to clean them, watching the sunlight sink behind the trees. Everything looked normal. There was no strange sound, no uneasy feeling, just a quiet forest cooling down for the night. Around an hour later, as the sky turned darker, I started to feel a subtle heaviness in the air. At first I thought it was just the drop in temperature, but it felt more like the forest itself was getting still in a way that didn't match the time of day. The stream kept flowing, but everything else became quiet. No birds, no rustling, no small animal movements. I ignored it. Most people would say forests get silent at night anyway. I made a small meal, ate slowly, and put everything away before it got completely dark. When I finally climbed into the tent, the first thing I noticed was how loud my heartbeat sounded. I tried to calm myself by breathing deeply. Nothing was wrong. I told myself that. I had camped alone many times before, but something about that place felt different, as if the entire forest was paying attention to me. I tried to sleep early, but the moment I closed my eyes, I felt the kind of alertness that comes when the body senses something before the mind does. I lay perfectly still, listening. For a long time, there was nothing. Not wind, not insects, not even the distant cracking of wood. Just complete stillness. Around midnight, the sound finally came. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was a slow, deliberate crunch of weight on dry needles. Far off but clear enough that I knew it wasn't a small animal. It had a rhythm to it, slow and careful, like someone trying not to be heard. My body tensed without me telling it to. The steps stopped, then started again, slightly closer. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe deeply. My tent fabric felt paper thin. Another step, then another, each one spaced out with long pauses. I tried to tell myself it could be a deer, but I had heard deer move before. They were lighter, quicker, more nervous in sound. This was something heavier, steadier, something that placed its weight down with purpose. When the steps stopped again, they seemed close enough that I thought I could reach out and touch whatever was making them. But I kept my arms locked beside me. I stared upward at the dark fabric of the tent, trying to control the shaking in my hands. Minutes passed, or maybe it was longer. My mind was racing, but my body refused to move. I didn't dare unzip the tent or make a sound. The forest was too quiet, and anything I did felt like it would echo endlessly. Then, just as slowly as it had started, the sound drifted away. Each step grew softer, more distant, until the forest returned to the same dead silence as before. I stayed awake the rest of the night, blinking at the dim shape of the tent roof, counting each breath. When morning came, the sunlight made the tent glow pale yellow. I waited until the forest felt normal again. Birds chirping, small rustling sounds, the stream moving confidently. Only then did I unzip the tent and step outside. First, nothing looked unusual, but when I walked along the line of trees behind the tent, I saw the prints in the soft dirt, large, deep impressions spaced in a slow pattern. Not boots, not shoes, bare feet, human-sized, maybe larger, pressed deep enough that they were left clean and clear in the cold earth. The tracks came from the forest, passed near the tent, then continued toward the stream and disappeared into the rocks on the other side. I stared at them longer than I should have. My skin crawled when I imagined someone walking barefoot at night through that freezing forest. It made no sense. No one traveled barefoot out there, and the direction the tracks came from was so deep in the woods that even the nearest village was hours away. I felt a strong urge to pack up and leave immediately, but I forced myself to move slowly, carefully. I didn't want to look panicked. I didn't know if the person, or whatever it was still nearby. I kept my eyes on the tree line while taking down the tent, listening again for any unusual sound. Everything sounded normal, which somehow made it more disturbing, like the forest was pretending nothing had happened. I filled my water bottle, checked my gear twice, and started walking back down the trail. The path that had felt peaceful the day before now felt narrow and dark. Every bend made my stomach tighten, because I couldn't see what might be waiting beyond it. Several times I thought I heard something behind me. Soft steps, faint breathing. But every time I turned around, the trail was empty. Took me less than half the time to get back to the car. When I finally saw it through the trees, relief washed through me so quickly that I almost dropped my pack. I opened the door, threw everything inside, and sat there with my hands gripping the steering wheel until they stopped shaking. As I drove away, I looked into the rearview mirror again and again. The forest stayed still and quiet behind me, not giving away anything about what had happened in the night. But the image of those footprints stayed in my mind, clearer than anything else. I never went back to that part of Austria. I never even tried to figure out who or what walked past my tent that night. I didn't want answers. Some things don't need explanations. Sometimes the most frightening part of an experience is knowing it was real and choosing not to look any deeper into it. The only thing I took from that trip was the understanding that even the quietest places hold secrets. And sometimes those secrets walk right past you in the dark, slow enough for you to hear every step, but careful enough that you never see their face. I still camp, but never alone, and never that deep into the wild again. That one night taught me to respect silence in a way I never had before, because now I know that silence isn't always empty. Sometimes it's just waiting. I was 27 when I decided to spend a weekend alone in the mountains of northern Spain in late October of 2019. I had been working long hours that month and thought a short camping trip might help me breathe a bit. I chose a quiet, less popular area near the Cantabrian Range, a place where most people only came in summer. By late autumn, it was usually empty, wet, and cold, but I liked that. I liked being away from everything and everyone for a while. The trip started normally. I drove up a narrow, cracked road that wound between dark pine trees and wet rock walls. The sky had been gray since morning, but the weather forecast only said light showers, so I didn't expect much trouble. I parked near a small dirt clearing and followed a trail deeper into the woods. The ground felt damp under my boots. The air had a heavy, earthy smell. I remember thinking it felt like a place where time moved slower. I set up my tent near a slope beside a shallow stream. The water made a soft, steady sound as it slid over stones, and at first that sound made me relax. I built a small fire, cooked a simple meal, and spent the late afternoon reading, listening to the wind push through the branches. There was nothing scary, nothing strange, nothing even unusual. Everything was calm. Then the rain started. At first, it was just a light tapping on the leaves above me, the kind of rain that feels harmless. But soon the drops grew harder and more steady, and the wind picked up a bit. I put out the fire before it got drowned and crawled into my tent. The air got colder fast. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the rain hit the fabric like fingers drumming constantly. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt sharp, restless, almost aggressive. By nightfall, the rain turned into a full storm. The wind pushed against the tent walls in hard bursts. Water slid down the sides in streams. Every few minutes, I felt the ground shift slightly under my sleeping pad as the soil soaked through. I kept checking the corners of the tent to make sure nothing was leaking. For the first hour or two, I tried to ignore how uneasy I felt. But something in the air seemed different. Not supernatural, just wrong. It was around 10 p.m. when I first heard it. Over the pounding of the rain, I caught a faint, uneven noise, a kind of scraping. Not metal, not wood, but something rough dragging over something else. It came from somewhere uphill, somewhere beyond the slope. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just a tree branch moving in the wind, but the noise didn't match the rhythm of the storm. It came in slow, irregular bursts. Scrape, pause, scrape again, longer pause, then silence. I lay there completely still, trying to pick apart the sounds of the rain so I could hear better. The storm made everything louder, but the scraping came again, a bit clearer this time. It was closer, a slow, dragging weight sliding over wet ground. My chest tightened a little. My breathing slowed without me trying. My stomach felt heavier, like I had swallowed a stone. I didn't move. I didn't even sit up. I only listened. The sound stopped for a long moment, long enough for me to start thinking it was nothing, just my mind exaggerating natural noises. Maybe a fallen tree trunk shifting in the mud. Maybe rocks rolling from the slope because the rain loosened them. But right when I almost convinced myself, I heard something else. Soft, muffled steps. Not animal steps. They were too heavy, too slow, too deliberate. Someone was out there. I held my breath, trying to track the direction. The steps came from the left side of the tent, somewhere between the trees. They weren't coming fast. They were careful, like whoever it was didn't want to be heard, but the wet ground made it impossible to stay silent. I felt my throat tighten. I felt a cold sweat forming even though the air was freezing. I kept thinking, who would even be out here in this weather? It made no sense. The area was usually empty, especially during storms. And even if someone did end up here, why were they walking so slowly and deliberately around my campsite? Why at night? Why in the rain? The steps stopped again. All I could hear was the storm beating the tent. I didn't move a single muscle. My sleeping bag felt like a trap instead of comfort. My flashlight was within reach, but I didn't grab it yet. I didn't want to draw attention. A few minutes passed. The storm got louder. Then I heard a new sound, something soft hitting the ground near the tent. A faint thud, like a small rock being dropped. Then another, then a slightly larger one. It didn't sound like random falling debris. It sounded placed. I felt something icy slide through my stomach. Someone was throwing small stones near my tent. Slowly, gently, like they were testing something. Maybe testing if I was awake. The rain muffled everything, but I could still hear each small thud, one after another. Not many, just a few, and then it stopped again. I finally reached for my flashlight and held it tight in my hand. I didn't turn it on. I just gripped it so hard my fingers started to ache. I stayed that way for a long time, trying to hear anything else. Eventually the storm shifted. the wind changed direction, and the scraping sound returned, but this time it was farther away, moving slowly downhill. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every minute felt like an hour. Every shift of the rain sounded like footsteps. Every gust of wind sounded like someone breathing. I stayed in the same position until dawn, barely blinking. When the first bit of pale gray light filtered through the tent, I finally worked up enough courage to unzip it. The air was ice cold. The rain had stopped, but everything looked washed out and soaked. The first thing I noticed was the mud. There were footprints, not boot prints like mine. These were flatter, wider, less defined, like someone wearing worn-out shoes or something without a firm sole. They were fresh, softened by rain, but still clear enough to follow. They came from the trees, circled around my tent in a slow, uneven path, and then stopped near the back of it. That's where I found the stones. 5 of them, small, smooth, placed in a half-circle formation. Not thrown randomly, placed, arranged neatly, like someone quietly crouched there in the rain doing it with steady hands. I felt a cold rush down my back. I looked uphill where the scraping sound had come from. The slope was covered in deep drag marks, like something heavy had been pulled down during the storm. They weren't natural. They were too straight, too intentional. I didn't waste time. I packed everything in minutes, throwing things into my backpack without caring about order. My hands shook the whole time. The silence of the morning felt worse than the noise of the night. I could feel the place watching me, even though I didn't see anyone. When I finally reached my car and locked the doors, I just sat there for a long moment, staring through the windshield at the wet trees. My heart was still beating too fast. I kept thinking about the stones, the footsteps, the dragging sound. Someone had been close to my tent for hours, maybe watching, maybe waiting, maybe just passing by. I had no idea, but the way the stones were placed made it clear they were not lost, confused, or wandering. They were purposeful. When I drove down the mountain, I didn't look in the rearview mirror more than once. I didn't want to know if anything was behind me. I never went back to that area again, and I never camped alone after that. The ending was simple, but clear. Nothing supernatural happened.
No Ghost, no Creature, no Fairy Tale.
Just a real person in the dark woods during a storm, moving slowly, placing things quietly, and staying too close to me for far too long. That was enough to change how I see the silence of the forest forever. Even years later, whenever it rains at night, I still hear that slow scraping sound somewhere in the back of my mind. And I still wonder what would have happened if I had stepped outside the tent that night instead of staying still. I'm glad I never found out. I went camping alone in the south of France in the summer of 2019, a few months after I turned 25. I had been working long hours for almost a year without a break, and I wanted a simple trip where I could stay close to nature, far from noise, people, and the stress of my job. I chose a quiet forest area near a small village called Valmont, not a famous tourist place, which was exactly what I wanted. The forest there was old, the trees tall and thick, and the ground covered with soft moss that stayed cool even in warm weather. I planned to stay 2 nights, hike around, take photos, and just let my mind slow down. I arrived in the late afternoon, parked my small rental car near a dirt trail, and walked deeper into the trees. The air smelled fresh, almost sweet, like pine and warm earth. There was a small river close by that I could hear running before I even saw it. When I reached the open patch of ground where I planned to camp, I felt good. The sunlight was still strong, the sky clear, and I didn't see anyone around. It felt like the perfect quiet spot. I set up my tent, then walked around to look for dry firewood. As I gathered sticks, I noticed the forest felt unusually still. I didn't hear birds, which was strange for that area. I told myself it could just be the time of day or the heat. It didn't bother me much then. After building a small fire and eating a simple meal, I watched the sun drop slowly behind the trees. The sky changed from bright gold to a deep blue that looked almost too soft to be real. When night came, the forest turned darker than I expected. The moon was blocked by thick branches, and the fire gave off only a small circle of light. I stayed close to it, listening to the crackling of the wood and letting the warm air settle around me. I felt comfortable enough, even if the silence felt heavier than before. I tried to relax, telling myself this was exactly why I came, to escape everything. But around midnight, I heard something. It was faint, something like footsteps, but softer. At first, I thought it was an animal, fox, maybe a deer. I didn't feel scared, but the sound came again, this time more controlled, almost slow, like someone was placing each step carefully. The sound stopped, then started again after a few seconds. I couldn't see anything past the firelight, so I sat still and tried to listen. The forest had gone completely silent again. No wind, no insects, nothing. The quiet made the sound clearer when it returned. I felt a cold wave move down my back. I turned off the small lantern I had beside me so my eyes could adjust. I waited quietly, trying to calm myself. I didn't want to overreact. It was a forest after all, not some dangerous place. I kept trying to tell myself that. The steps grew faint again and disappeared. After a few minutes of silence, I convinced myself an animal had just wandered near the camp. I tried to sleep. I didn't rest long. I woke to the feeling that something was not right. I didn't know why at first, but when I opened my eyes, I noticed the fire had almost died. The forest around me was pitch black. I reached for my lantern, turned it on, and sat up. My chest felt tight. I scanned the area, the light from the lantern cutting through the darkness just enough to show the edge of my camp. That's when I saw him, a man, standing just inside the trees, facing my direction. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He didn't seem surprised or confused. He just stood there like he had been watching me for a long time. His clothes looked dirty, old, like he had been living outdoors for weeks. His face was partly covered by shadows, but I could make out a long beard and dull eyes that didn't look away. He wasn't close enough to touch me, but close enough that one quick step would bring him into the camp. My hands shook as my body started to react before I even processed the situation. The lantern light flickered slightly, making the shadows around him shift. I froze. I had no idea how long he had been there. Had he been the one walking around earlier? Was he watching me while I slept? The thought made my stomach tighten. I grabbed my pack slowly, trying not to alert him, but he stayed still. Not a single movement. I realized I needed to leave right away. Staying even one more minute in the dark with a stranger watching me felt dangerous. My car was 20 minutes away through the trees, not a long walk during the day, but at night it felt like the path could swallow me if I made one wrong move. I didn't pack everything. I didn't even try. I only took the lantern, my phone, and a small knife I carried for cutting rope and food. I slowly backed away, never letting the light leave the man's direction. He didn't move, not even a twitch. His stillness felt unnatural, but not in a supernatural way. More like he was planning something or waiting for a chance to act. When I got far enough, I turned fast and started walking through the trees. The darkness was thick, and my heart was pounding. I kept turning back, flashing the light behind me to see if he was following. For the first few minutes, I didn't see anything. Then I caught sight of movement behind the trees. Not fast, not running, but steady, like he was walking the same path I was. I pushed myself harder, almost running, trying to stay quiet. My legs felt weak, and the uneven ground made it hard not to trip. Every time I turned the lantern back, I saw nothing but trees, but I knew he wasn't far. I could feel it. The last stretch toward the car felt endless. I recognized the old fallen tree near the path and knew I was close. The air felt colder, and my breathing was sharp and loud. When I finally reached the small dirt clearing where my car was parked, I almost cried from relief, but the fear didn't leave. My hands shook so much that I dropped the keys twice before unlocking the door. Before getting inside, I looked back one more time. There he was, standing at the tree line the same way he had been near my camp, still silent, watching. The lantern light reached his face this time, and I saw how empty his expression was. His eyes didn't look angry or scared. They looked blank, like he wasn't fully there. That frightened me even more. I got into the car, locked the doors, and started the engine so quickly the tires kicked dirt behind me. I drove straight to the village without stopping. When I reached the small guest house where I had planned to check out the next day, I parked right in front and sat in the car for a few minutes trying to steady my breathing. I didn't sleep that night. The image of the man standing in the forest stayed with me for hours. The next morning, after the sun came up, I returned with 2 local guards. They checked the forest, walked all the way to my campsite, and even farther. They didn't find anyone. They told me the area sometimes had travelers, hikers, or people living off the land, but no one had reported anything strange recently. My tent was still there, untouched. My things were scattered exactly as I had left them, but I knew what I saw. I didn't stay another night. I packed everything and drove back to the city. Even now, years later, I still think about that moment when I woke up and saw him standing at the edge of my camp. The stillness, the blank expression, the quiet steps in the dark. It all felt too real to forget. The ending to the story is simple but clear. I survived, but the fear stayed with me. It made me understand how vulnerable I was that night, alone in a foreign forest with no one around. I never went camping alone again after that. Not because of ghosts or myths or anything like that, but because of one silent man standing in the dark, watching me with empty eyes. That was more than enough to change the way I travel forever. It was the summer of 2013, deep in the rugged mountains of eastern Afghanistan, when I found myself on what was supposed to be a routine reconnaissance mission. I was 25 at the time, a squad leader in the 3rd Infantry, and my team had been tasked with observing a remote valley for enemy movement. The mountains were unforgiving, jagged peaks slicing the sky, and the heat during the day was brutal, but the nights brought a cold so sharp it burned through your clothes. We were supposed to camp for a couple of nights to gather intel and then pull back before dawn, but things rarely went according to plan out there. Our convoy had dropped us off late in the afternoon. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain. The valley we were assigned to monitor was narrow, flanked by cliffs that rose almost vertically, and the only way in or out was a narrow, winding trail barely wide enough for a mule. We set up our temporary camp on a ledge that gave us a clear view of the valley floor. I made sure every tent was secured with extra stakes. The wind could howl down the mountains and sweep someone off if they weren't careful. We checked our weapons, counted our ammo, and I made the rounds, making sure each of my 4 men was in place and ready. The first night was quiet, almost unnervingly so. I could hear the distant wind wailing through the rocks, carrying a metallic scent of iron and dust. It was so still that even a small movement in the bushes below could be heard. I lay on my cot, trying to rest, but my mind wouldn't let me. Every rustle made me tense. Every shadow seemed like it could be someone watching us. Around 2 in the morning, I noticed something off. The pattern of the stars in the sky had shifted slightly. It was subtle, but instinctively I knew it meant a storm was brewing. Not just rain, this area had sudden flash floods, and floods in a narrow valley like that could be lethal. By dawn, the storm had arrived in full force. The rain pounded the ledge, turning the dirt into thick mud, washing away some of our makeshift paths. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. We couldn't use the radios because the storm interfered with the signal, and moving was nearly impossible. We huddled in our tents, but even inside the thin fabric, the cold seeped in. The constant patter of rain was hypnotic, almost drowning out the occasional distant crack of what could have been falling rocks. I knew we had to maintain surveillance, but leaving the tents felt suicidal. It was during that night that things started to feel wrong. I noticed tracks in the mud around our camp, large, irregular prints that weren't ours. They circled the tents, coming close enough that I could swear I could see the outlines of boots, but there were no humans in sight. My heart sank. The valley had been quiet for weeks, according to intel. Whoever or whatever made these tracks wasn't supposed to be there. I checked my weapon again, tightened my grip, and tried to rationalize it. Maybe local shepherds, maybe animals, but the size, the depth, and the way the prints moved around the camp as if checking us out, it didn't feel natural. By the second night, the storm had lessened but left the trails slick and dangerous. I decided to do a solo sweep down the narrow trail, carrying only my rifle and a flashlight. The others were on watch, tense but trusting me. I moved slowly, every step calculated. The further down the trail I went, the more evident it became that we weren't alone. Bits of equipment caught in the underbrush, scraps of what looked like fabric from military fatigues, even a small bundle of supplies that had clearly been dropped deliberately or accidentally. It was as if someone had been here recently, maybe even watching us for hours. My skin crawled, but I kept moving. Then I heard it, a faint click, almost like a camera shutter or a mechanical device. My head snapped up, shining my flashlight toward the sound, but the storm's aftermath had made visibility poor, and the light reflected off the wet rocks, making it impossible to distinguish shapes. I froze, listening. Nothing moved. I counted my breaths. Slowly, I turned and walked back, doubling my pace without running. By the time I reached the camp, my team was alert, guns ready. I explained the sounds and the tracks. Their eyes widened. "You saw them too?" one of them asked, though we spoke in whispers. It was clear we were all feeling the same cold, crawling dread. We decided to stay put, fortifying the camp as best as we could. The valley's narrow walls meant we couldn't retreat quickly without exposing ourselves. So we hunkered down and waited for extraction the next day. Sleep was impossible. The tension was unbearable. Every rustle in the underbrush, every shadow in the moonlight, made our hearts jump. I kept my rifle beside me at all times, finger resting lightly on the trigger. The final night was the worst. Around midnight, I heard movement just below our ledge. I crawled to the edge and looked through binoculars. My stomach dropped. There were figures moving in the mud, carrying backpacks and what looked like weapons. They weren't Taliban, at least not the regular fighters we knew. Their movements were calculated, almost military in discipline, but they avoided making any direct noise. They were closing in on our camp, probing, testing. I realized we had been watched since the day we arrived. The valley had been mapped, studied, and our every move tracked. Whoever they were, they weren't here to negotiate. I had to make a decision. Staying put meant certain confrontation in a few hours, with the advantage firmly in their hands. I gathered the team, whispered the plan, and we moved silently down a secondary trail I had noticed during the daylight. The mud made it treacherous. One wrong step could mean sliding down the cliff into the raging river below. The rain had carved new paths, but I followed them, leading the team like a shadow through the dark. Every step was a gamble, every sound amplified. By the first light of morning, we had reached a small outcropping with radio reception. I called in our coordinates and requested immediate extraction. The helicopter arrived within the hour, slicing through the mist like a phantom. We climbed aboard, wet, exhausted, and silent, but alive. Looking back at the valley as we lifted off, I could see the figures still moving in the mud, their presence lingering like a shadow over the land. The experience stayed with me. Months later, after debriefings and reports, I learned that the valley had been used by an unknown armed group, possibly mercenaries or rogue operatives, who had evaded detection for months. No direct confrontation had occurred, but they had been ready, patient, and methodical. We had survived not by force, but by caution, observation, and luck. Back on base, I couldn't shake the image of the muddy prints circling our tents, the faint mechanical clicks in the night, and the disciplined shadows moving silently in the storm. I realized that in war, fear isn't always about bullets or explosions. Sometimes, it's about the waiting, the uncertainty, and the knowledge that something capable, intelligent, and dangerous is watching you, just out of reach. In the end, the mission was technically a success. We gathered intel without a firefight, but the memory of those nights in the storm, of the valley and its unseen watchers, stayed with me. Every time I camped in training exercises afterward, the images returned. The slick mud, the cold wind cutting through my clothes, and the sense of being seen when I was sure I was alone. I learned that fear, when real and unrelenting, isn't something you escape. It's something you endure, survive, and carry with you. I never thought a simple research trip would turn into something that would haunt my memory for the rest of my life. It was 2018, I was 27, freshly graduated with a PhD in epidemiology, and I had been granted funding for a small project studying zoonotic diseases in the remote forests of Slovenia. The aim was to collect samples from wild animals, soil, and water sources, mapping any unusual bacteria or viruses. I was meticulous, organized, and confident. I thought I could handle anything the forest threw at me. I was wrong. I arrived in Slovenia in late September. The air was crisp, carrying a faint smell of damp leaves and moss. I rented a small cabin in the edge of Triglav National Park as my base. My plan was to camp for a few days in the deeper parts of the forest to collect soil and water samples, track animal footprints, and record environmental data. I had all my equipment: portable lab kit, sterilized containers, field microscope, GPS tracker, emergency beacon, and a fully charged satellite phone. I even had extra batteries, rainproof notebooks, and protective gear. I felt prepared. The first 2 days in the forest were peaceful. I hiked long trails, cataloged small mammals, collected water from streams, and swabbed soil from under rocks and fallen logs. I noted everything in my journals meticulously: the temperature, the humidity, the soil pH, the animal tracks. Each night, I slept in a small tent I had pitched near a clearing. I made a small fire for warmth and boiled water for drinking. The forest was silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves, the distant call of a fox, and the soft patter of rain. It was beautiful, but a strange feeling lingered, like the forest was observing me. I brushed it off. On the third day, I decided to move deeper into the forest. The GPS showed a small clearing near a stream that hadn't been sampled. The path was overgrown, the underbrush thick, and the terrain uneven. I noticed old tracks, big, human-like footprints, but irregular. They were faint, almost as if whoever had made them was careful not to leave traces. But I didn't think much of it. By late afternoon, I reached the clearing. I started taking samples from the stream, testing pH levels, and setting up small traps for small mammals. That's when I noticed it, the smell. A sharp, metallic odor, like iron mixed with decay. I scanned the area. There was nothing visible at first, but the smell was overpowering. I traced it to a shallow ditch partially hidden by ferns. Inside, half buried under leaves, was a small, decayed animal carcass. It looked recent. I documented it, collected a swab for my research, and moved on. As evening fell, the forest grew colder and denser. Shadows stretched unnaturally, and the wind carried strange, almost rhythmic noises, like something heavy moving across dry leaves. I set up my tent in the clearing closer to the stream. I double-checked my supplies, boiled water, and secured the tent flaps. I told myself it was just the forest, my imagination, the isolation messing with my senses. That night, I woke up drenched in sweat. I had heard something, faint, deliberate footsteps circling my tent. My heart raced, and I stayed perfectly still, listening. The sound stopped, then moved away. I rationalized it. Deer, foxes, or some other forest animal. I was too tired to do more than shiver and hope the sound hadn't been human. The next morning, I found fresh footprints around my tent. Large, muddy, not human, but not exactly animal either. I examined them carefully. The toes were elongated, slightly curved, and the stride was too wide for a normal human. My rational mind screamed wildlife, but a part of me whispered that something wasn't right. Still, I pressed on. I needed these samples for my research. That day, while collecting water samples upstream, I noticed something strange in the water. The stream's current was slow, but there was a strange reddish sediment swirling in a small pool. I knelt to test it, and my gloves brushed against something soft. I looked closer and froze. There, half submerged in the muddy water, was a human hand. Pale, bloated, fingernails darkened. I stumbled back, heart pounding, stomach twisting. I knew I had to stay calm. I recorded the coordinates, took photographs, and carefully avoided touching anything. My first instinct was to leave immediately and report it, but the area was deep in the forest, far from roads. My GPS had no signal, and my satellite phone was showing low battery. Panic rose in my chest, but I forced myself to plan. By afternoon, I decided to hike back to a safer area near the main trail. The forest seemed different now, heavier, almost suffocating. Branches scraped against my tent bag as if they were reaching for me, and the rhythmic noises I had heard before returned, louder, more deliberate. I kept looking behind me, expecting to see someone, anyone, but there was only darkness between the trees. When I finally emerged near a secondary trail, I noticed a small clearing that seemed untouched until I saw the tent. Another tent, identical to mine in size and color, standing perfectly pitched, no sign of anyone around. My blood ran cold. I approached cautiously. Inside, I saw traces of belongings. A backpack, a journal, half a sandwich. It looked like someone had been here recently, maybe watching me. The rational part of my mind said, "Stay calm. This could be a fellow researcher." But the instinctive part screamed danger. I decided not to stay. I packed my equipment quickly and headed toward the main path. The forest seemed to respond. Branches snapped behind me, distant footsteps echoed, and the metallic smell from before returned, stronger this time. I realized it wasn't just an animal. I wasn't alone, and whoever or whatever was moving silently, watching me, calculating my path. Hours later, exhausted, bleeding from scratches and covered in mud, I reached a ranger station at the edge of the forest. The rangers were shocked when I showed them the GPS coordinates and photographs. They organized a search team immediately. Later, they told me that the area I had been in was known for illegal activities, poaching, and occasionally criminal camps. The human-like footprints weren't animal at all. The half-buried carcasses and traces were evidence of poachers hiding stolen wildlife, and the hand I found had been from a recent, unrelated accident in the forest. The rangers thanked me for documenting it, but warned me never to go that deep again without proper support. Even now, years later, I can't shake the memory. The cold, wet forest, the heavy silence that wasn't silence, the feeling of being observed by something calculating. I completed my research, but the thrill and pride I felt were forever tainted by the fear I experienced. I realized that knowledge has a price, and sometimes curiosity can lead you straight into danger. I never camped alone in the forest again. I always make sure someone knows exactly where I am, and I triple-check every piece of equipment. I still work in medical research, but I stick to labs now. The forest taught me a lesson about respect, preparation, and fear, a lesson I will never forget. It was the summer of 2018, and I had just turned 24. I decided to take a solo camping trip in the forests near Lake Superior, Michigan. I wanted something different from the usual weekend hikes and cabin stays. Something raw, away from roads, away from cell signals, away from people. I was looking for solitude and maybe a bit of challenge. I had planned the trip for months, studying maps, learning about the wildlife, making a gear checklist. My plan was to hike into a remote area, set up camp near the water, fish, and spend 3 days alone. I started my hike in the morning, carrying a backpack that was probably heavier than it should have been, filled with a small tent, sleeping bag, stove, extra food, water, and emergency gear. The forest was thick, dense with pine and birch, and the trail quickly narrowed as I went deeper. The air smelled clean and earthy, and there was a distant hum of insects. Birds sang high above, and I could hear woodpeckers hammering on trees, the kind of sounds that make you feel both alive and alone. By mid-afternoon, I reached a clearing by a narrow stream that fed into Lake Superior. It was perfect. Flat ground, access to water, some natural cover from the trees, and far enough from the main trail that I wouldn't be disturbed. I unpacked my gear, set up my tent, and collected firewood. The sun was still high, but the forest had shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally long. I cooked a simple meal of canned beans and rice over the portable stove. The quiet around me was almost unnatural, and as I ate, I started noticing small things. The distant snap of a branch that sounded too deliberate to be an animal, the occasional rustle in the underbrush that stopped as soon as I looked in that direction. At first, I told myself it was paranoia, that my brain was just amplifying the usual sounds of a forest. But as the day wore on, the feeling didn't fade. It grew. After dinner, I walked down to the stream to refill my water bottle. That's when I noticed footprints, large, deep impressions in the mud, leading from the far side of the clearing to the edge of the stream. They weren't human, not entirely. I've hiked a lot and I recognized most animal tracks, deer, raccoon, even bear, but these were different. Bigger than a bear paw with what looked like claws, and they weren't spaced like a bear walking on all fours. My heart started racing. I double-checked my campsite, making sure my tent was zipped, my backpack was close, my knife was within reach. The sun was starting to drop, and shadows lengthened even faster than I thought possible. The forest was suddenly colder than before, and a fog began creeping along the ground near the stream, thickening the air. I started my small campfire and sat close, trying to convince myself to relax. Night fell, and with it came silence. Not the peaceful silence you imagine when you go camping, but a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to swallow every sound. Even the insects and birds had disappeared. I stayed up by the fire for hours, staring at the flames, occasionally glancing toward the edge of the clearing. Every rustle, every snap of a twig made me flinch. I thought about packing up and hiking back out, but it was dark, and I didn't want to get lost. Around midnight, I heard it, the first clear sign that I wasn't alone. A deep, low growl coming from the trees at the far end of the clearing. Not a dog, not a wolf. It sounded intelligent, like something was assessing me. My pulse shot through the roof. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the sound. Nothing, just trees swaying slightly in the wind, shadows shifting in ways that made my stomach churn. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a large predator, maybe a bear. Bears weren't typically aggressive at this time of year unless provoked. But these sounds were deliberate, constant. I kept my fire going, added more wood, and tried to stay awake. I didn't want to sleep, didn't want to be unprepared if whatever it was decided to come closer. Hours passed. The sounds continued, circling my campsite but never coming fully into view. I stayed as still as possible, keeping my breathing slow, waiting for sunrise. At some point, I realized the creature wasn't just around my campsite. It was following the stream, moving silently, carefully, as though it knew I was there but didn't want to reveal itself yet. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed. I packed my gear in record time, careful not to make noise. I left the clearing as quickly as possible, moving downstream along the trail I had scouted earlier. Every step, every crack of a branch under my boot felt amplified. My eyes kept darting into the woods, half expecting to see a massive shape watching me. I made it back to my car by late morning. Relief hit me like a physical force when I saw the familiar vehicle. I checked my surroundings one last time before driving off. There was no sign of tracks beyond the clearing. Whatever had been following me didn't pursue me to the road. Later, I went back with a wildlife expert to examine the area. He admitted he had no explanation for the tracks. Larger than any known predator in the region, claws shaped differently than bear or wolf, stride too long for a known animal. It left a lingering sense of unease. I didn't return to that forest for a long time, and when I finally did, I made sure to camp in established sites with other people around. That trip taught me something important. The forest is beautiful, but it is also unpredictable. There are things out there that we don't see often, that we don't understand. It doesn't need to be supernatural to be terrifying. It's the quiet intelligence in the unknown, the careful patience of a creature you can't see, that makes it frightening. Looking back, I realized how unprepared I was, not just physically but mentally. I had underestimated how much being truly alone in a vast, wild place can affect your mind. The relief of leaving the forest wasn't just about safety. It was about reclaiming normalcy, returning to a world where I understood the threats. Even now, I can picture that clearing, the stream, the fog creeping along the ground, and I can feel the tension, the weight of being watched. But I also remember the sunrise, the way the first light felt almost holy after hours of fear, the overwhelming sense of relief when I finally stepped onto the dirt road leading out. That ending, getting back to the road and then home, was as clear as it could be. I survived, and I survived because I respected the unknown, stayed calm when I could, and never underestimated the forest again. It wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't a ghost story. It was real. And that reality, the sheer unpredictability of the wild, is enough to make the blood run cold if you're not careful.